Hi and welcome back to our UV mapping tutorial. So we'll continue on in this video mapping our character. Now since a lot of the procedures are the same, a lot of this video will be sped up. So we're going to start with the belt today, and just like before, we will isolate the belt, we'll apply an UVW unwrap, and we will put a planar projection on it. We'll then mark out the seam, and we will check to make sure all the stretching has been eliminated. Okay, in the case of the belt, I'm going to hide the seam behind the buckle. If you have a look at the belt that we just laid out, you can see that one end is smaller than the other. This has resulted in a different textile density across the belt. Textile density at its most basic is the texture resolution on the model. A good textile density ensures that our model's textures will look crisp and clean and not blurry or distorted when in game. Now, textile density is important when creating any game asset, so it's important to understand why we are doing this. Our textures make the character, area level, or whatever look a certain way and more believable to the player or viewer. This belief can be broken or suspended by bad textile density, so keeping the textile density consistent across your model is important, and is as easy as using the grid texture and making sure the spacing is as even as possible, or that each grid square stays square. There will be some areas, particularly on a character, that we can squeeze or hide that are not visible by the player in game, but overall we want to keep the textile density as even as possible. When we're talking about textile density, there's usually about three main factors that we are actually talking about. So the model size, the UV shell size, which is one of these laid out UV sets that we're working on at the moment, and the texture resolution of the map, or the map size, so the texture map itself. It can get really complicated, so for the purpose of this tutorial we'll focus on keeping the grid texture as even as possible. So you can see, in order to fix the textile density on my belt, I cut a new seam in, I relayed the part that was smaller, and then stitched them back together to make sure that all the grid was even across the entire belt. And with that done, we can continue on laying out our UVs. Okay, so now with the belt complete, we can move on to the buckle. For the buckle, I'm going to create a seam, one around the back face and one on each of the four corners, in order to get the textile density as even as possible. So just using the same procedure as the belt, the pants and the boot. So the buckle was pretty quick and easy to do, so we can move on to the shirt now. So just laying the UVs out the same way as we did everything else, and looking for stretching and textile density on the overall model. So again, we want to hide the seams as much as possible, so with the shirt, since the vest will be covering it, we can lay the seam down at the back. So with the shirt here, I'm just looking at the textile density at the side, and I'm not quite happy with how it's laid out. Now, because the vest is over it, it is hidden a little bit, to some extent anyway, but if we applied animation to the vest, it would become a little bit more visible. So I want to get it as even as possible. So just breaking the seams down the side here, and then I'm going to play around to see if I can get that stretching or the grid to be as even as possible, and to get rid of some of that squishing that is happening around the side there. So here I'm just messing around with the scale and seeing if I can get the bias to stop the squishing. It's not really working, so I'm going to just mess around with it to see what else I can do. So I might just do it a bit more, I'll do it manually. Once I'm happy with that, I will collapse the stack again and move on to the next part of the body, which will be the arms, I think. Okay, so moving on to the arms, we'll do the same thing as before, but I'm only going to work on one arm and then I'll mirror it across so that they share the same space within the UV map later. So just working on the one arm at the moment. So the same way as before, applying a planar map, defining the seam, and in this case with the arm, I'm going to do underneath the arm, take the seam underneath in order to keep the seam as invisible as possible. And then of course splitting in areas in order to get the textile density the same across the entire arm. So I haven't done the hand at the moment, so I'm doing from the wrist to the shoulder. Mapping organic shapes can be quite tricky. There's a lot of areas like this that can cause stretching and warping in the texture, so we just do our best to minimize this as much as we can. Sometimes splitting and combining isn't enough, so sometimes we have to go in with into like UV mode and just tweak each UV separately to get the result that we need, or the result that we require. Okay, so when I've stitched everything together, one of the UVs have tried to join with the other side. So what we can do is we can go in here with using target weld and just weld that UV back. And looking in the viewport, you can see that everything is nice and even. I wasn't happy with how this was working out, so I pelt mapped that again, and I'm just going to scale these up to try and get the density correct. As I mentioned before, it can be quite tricky to get some organic shapes to lay out correctly. So again, it can be just all a matter of experimenting and tweaking. Okay, once I'm happy with the arm, I can move on to the hand. So same as before, just applying the planar map and starting to set out the seams. So the hands can be a little bit tricky because of all the fingers and the movement, so it can be hard to figure out where to hide the seams. A good point is to try and keep as much of the hand intact as possible. This will help you when you're texturing, so you're not trying to figure out where things join up. So a good place to put the seams would be between the fingers, so hidden between two fingers, so that you can't see it when the hand is just moving or holding something, and just split them into two shells, so the front and the back of the hand. I'm also going to put a seam around each of the fingernails just to separate that from the finger, and in order to get the textile density correct, I might separate the fingers and then rejoin them again. Another thing to watch out for when we're doing this is overlapping UVs. So in areas like this, go in and make sure that there aren't any UVs that are right on top of each other, or going underneath when they should be, like here. See how when we pelt mapped that, they were really close together? You want to pull them out and make sure that they're not going underneath where they shouldn't be, and make sure that each UV has its kind of own space. Moving on, we'll do some of the smaller fiddly bits like the tongue, the teeth, the eyes, the eyelash and the eyebrows. So again, the same way as before, but since these areas are a lot simpler, there'll be a lot less tweaking and fiddling with the UVs. Okay, with the eye, we're going to do the same thing we did with the arm and only work on one half, and that way we can mirror it over later so that they're sharing the same space on our texture map. So once we're happy with this side too, and the outer shell as well, so both eye shells, we can clone them and mirror them over to the other side. That way that the UVs will be, for both eyes, will be sharing the same space. Okay, once we're done with that, we'll continue on in the next video.